Hello, I'm Harry Brigazzi. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Government Outcomes Lab in the Blavatnik School of Government here at the University of Oxford. And it's my great pleasure to be hosting a conversation about innovation in the public sector. This is a topic that we at the Go Lab are particularly concerned with. Our research and policy work is all about how governments work with the non-profit sector, the private sector, to improve social outcomes. So we're often talking about innovation, but much of that discussion is about how difficult it is, about why innovation doesn't stick, and about why it doesn't become institutionalized, why new models struggle to scale even after a successful pilot, and so on. So that's the topic of this conversation. Why is innovation in the public sector so difficult, and what can be done about it? And to discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by Aneta Wierzynska and Jonathan Ung. They're both part of the 2024 cohort of Fellows of Practice. This is a group of policymakers and practitioners who join us at the Go Lab for a year. We work through our mutual interests, mutual problems, and learn from each other. They'll say more about their background soon, but just to introduce them briefly, Aneta is an attorney, a risk management expert, and a former fraud investigator, currently working at the Global Fund to fight AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. Jonathan is senior legal counsel at the United States Agency for International Development, where he was previously acting managing director of their innovation division. So you'll note from that they're both working in foreign assistance specifically, but we hope that the conversation can be broadly applicable, not just about foreign aid, but also to public sector more generally. So why am I talking with two lawyers about innovation, you may well ask? Their roles are all about compliance, about risk management, control. In fact, Aneta, at our annual conference last year, Aneta said to a room full of self-identifying innovators, "I'm the person who stopped your projects," was her message. So it may seem counterintuitive, but actually that's precisely why we saw the value in having Jonathan and Aneta talk about this. It's an opportunity to hear from people inside the bureaucracies. And it's precisely because you are the people who say no that anyone involved in innovation in government needs to hear your insight into the matter. We're going to be basically free form about this. I'm largely just going to let Jonathan and Aneta talk, but we hope to pin down answers to three key questions. First, what's the problem? So why does much of the status quo approach to innovation fail? What's the solution, or solutions more likely? And how do you get there? So more practical advice for people who are watching and listening, who may be involved in innovation or have an innovative idea that they're trying to get underway. And let me finally say that the views that we'll be hearing from Aneta and Jonathan are their personal opinions. They aren't speaking on behalf of their respective organizations. So why don't I pass to you first, Aneta, to tell us a little more about your background and how you came to be interested in innovation.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. We're really excited to be on this first podcast of GoLab and really excited to kind of lend insight into this topic from a controller viewpoint. I mean, I think you summarized my background pretty well. Maybe I'll start by saying that, not all lawyers are saying no. I think all of us have had an experience when we see that just doing what's done day to day is just not working. It's not achieving objectives. And maybe I'll just share a quick experience that got me into an innovation space, even within my role, which was my first experience as an investigator in a different aid agency and then when I worked here. But basically, what I realized is that we were assuring that money was used correctly by checking documentation and data, and then when we actually landed in the location to see if the documents bore out the reality, it turned out that nothing had been constructed, nothing had happened. So it really set me on a track of innovation track to ask the question, how do we actually make sure that public funding is used for its intended purposes? And that's what I've been doing my whole life. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to also be with you all and part of this podcast. And that it was funny, the first time I think we met was at that conference, the SOC 23 conference, the social outcomes conference that Harry was talking about. And you raised your hand and basically kind of put a silence of the room and said, I'm that activity killer. I'm that wet blanket kind of position. But then you said, but because I come from a background of risk, I'm actually best positioned often to identify how to make this work. And I think that's the main point of what we're trying to talk about here today. If there's one kind of key message I hope we can convey at the end of this, is just that sometimes oftentimes when you come from the risk background, whether it's lawyers, compliance people, auditors, especially in bureaucracies, you are actually best positioned to be innovative and to help ideas actually stick, because those people who know the rules and regulations the best are the best positioned often to actually implement ideas. And so I said in the past too, perhaps we don't need any more like big ideas. Perhaps we need to focus even more so on implementing the existing ones we have already. So diving into that, yeah, I think that to kind of, or at least a little bit of introduction myself, you heard a little bit, but I'm currently at USAID, as Harry mentioned. And before that, I was part of an international NGO, another type of bureaucracy as their general counsel. And then I came from private practice. And so, yeah, I think that what we're saying is broadly applicable perhaps to innovation and bureaucracies more generally, and the whole concept of, so why don't these big ideas tend to stick? And we have some perspectives on that, and to provide a little bit more color too, just diving into some of the context. Let me paint the scene a little bit. So we're talking in this case a little bit more about foreign assistance, if you will, but you're seeing what I see sometimes from the USAID perspective, or more broadly US government sometimes, is the idea that we want to attract more funding in to address the sustainable development goals as part of international development agenda, the 2030 goals, the SDGs. We're saying, hey, look, though, philanthropy and government funding alone is not sufficient. We get that. So we need to tap into the resources of the private sector. How do we do that? Well, we need innovative solutions to do that. We need to change the ways bureaucracy and government in particular works. So there's a lot of push for that in order to achieve the SDGs, hence a lot of talk about why we need innovation. The challenge,
Jonathan, can I maybe jump in? I think we're all working on different innovations in our different spaces, because Harry, in GoLab, you've been looking at SIBs, right? Social impact bonds and development impact bonds as an innovation. I think that's where your question is. And in my world, the innovations in global health have really been around also involving private sector, both in execution of health on the ground, as well as in financing, but also, the localization agenda, which I think is also something that we have in common, where we're trying to tap into implementers that I think would very often seem high risk from a sort of fiduciary standpoint. But we know that they're the best position to access certain populations. So there's a lot of innovations that basically our executives are asking us to push to change the way we do business, to be smarter and more agile to achieve our objectives. So I just thought I'd share a few examples of what we mean by innovations from our space. But Jonathan, you and I were talking about like innovations that come from the outside versus the inside. Maybe you can kind of unpack what you mean by that, because I think we see that a lot.
Yeah, so there's typically two ends of the spectrum, and you might typically have people who aren't used to working in bureaucracies who maybe come in, whether they're appointees or other kind of senior leaders, and really they come in with these great ideas, and the problem sometimes is that they don't fully understand the rules and regulations of bureaucracy, and so trying to implement these ideas then becomes a challenge. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have oftentimes people who are too far into the bureaucracy. Sometimes people like us, where we're too into the weeds on the rules and regulations, and then that's where you get kind of that reputation of saying, okay, no, don't do this, you can't do this, don't try something new. And so, what is it, right? Like, how do you then make that work? How do you take those ideas and actually make it work within a large bureaucracy with a complex web of rules and regulations? That's what we're trying to talk about.
And let's maybe unpack what we've been talking about in terms of what makes it so difficult around this, right? We were talking about, bureaucracy generally doesn't carry a good connotation. And what are the things about bureaucracies that make it so hard to innovate? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, a couple. Well, the first I would say is when you think about typically how activities come together in a large bureaucracy, I find that it's largely done in a silo. And so you think about where you might have a program team or design team at the initial stage. They're saying, hey, we have this awesome idea for designing an activity. And so they start that design, and then they kind of get it into a place where it can start moving forward within the machinery, if you will. Then they send it over to the next silo, and it's maybe the contracting team. And they say, okay, guys, we have this great idea. What should we do? What instrument should we use this? Should we use for funding it? Contracts, grants, or something else? Then you kick it over to, maybe the lawyers next, and you say, hey, lawyers, tell us all the red flags here, or all the compliance issues we might have. And then you kick it over to the budget or accounting people, and then they start looking at it from a funding perspective, all the way up through the chain finally, and then it gets approved. But the point is, it's done in these silos. So that's an initial challenge. I don't know, do you see that as well, Aneta, kind of in some of your work as well?
I do, and I think the silos, it's a very interesting dynamic, because on the one hand, the reason why bureaucracies got made into silos like this is because they're inherently set up not for innovation, right? They're set up to replicate at scale, and and each silo is in fact set up to do its very narrow task. So you would imagine like you're in one of these tankers, right? And you're like the guy who does the switch in the like engine room, and your switch only goes this way and that way, and you don't actually have a sense of all the other functionalities of this tanker. You just have your thing to do, and that's your job, and that's great. If that's what you want, if you just want a tanker to continue its status quo and continue producing the same direction that you've been going, then that kind of works. One could argue whether it's efficient or not, but one could argue. What we're talking about innovation is saying, actually, let's turn the tanker, right? Or let's use the tanker for a slightly different way of moving forward, or at a different speed, or in a different way. And then what you've got is, first of all, most silos don't understand that they're just one piece of a bigger puzzle and how they fit into that. Their job is just to focus on their pieces, right? So that's one thing that's difficult. And their job is also to avoid the risk that's only their risk to control. And so their job isn't to say, hey, I know you want to do this great programmatic thing. I'm the procurement person. You're saying that you don't know how to price this correctly. That's okay, because I understand your programmatic objective is more important than my pricing, bringing it down objective, for example. My job is to prove that I've brought that price down as far as possible, and that's it. I've got to do that, because that's how my silo gets measured, right? So I'm curious, Jonathan, in your experience, do you think that people working in each functional silo in a bureaucracy, do you think that they fully understand the breadth of their own rules and flexibilities?
Yeah, no, it's a great point about an analogy you're using there. And I think that is the challenge. That very question you just asked was that, kind of to answer it in a more general way, who is seeing it from a holistic perspective about how it all eventually comes in together.
Yeah.
That is the problem with the silos at the end of the day. So, who's actually seeing how each piece comes together and fitting into that larger whole, with also the understanding of the rules and regulations to kind of navigate the ultimate end goal, and that's to execute a great idea. But I think that is the heart of the challenge.
Yeah, I think one thing we were talking about, which I thought was particularly interesting, Jonathan, is you were talking about um, how, in actuality, many innovations, what we call innovations, often to execute them, to operationalize them, it doesn't require anything more than just operationalizing certain parts of the regulatory framework in an organization that simply has not been needed for the status quo approach.
Yeah.
So it's sort of
Yeah.
lying there on the side. It's completely appropriate. It's already approved. It's already in the regs, right? Legally, it's allowed, but no one's thought to pick up that set of tools because it hasn't been needed for a long time. So
That's the classic. I'm only going to do something because that's how I'm used to doing it kind of refrain, right? I think a lot of us in bureaucracies have heard that before. You go to one silo and you say, "Hey guys, can we try something new?" And then you get the pushback of, "Well, I don't know, but let's just stick to what I'm used to doing."
yeah. Could you give us some examples of, Jonathan, have you ever seen innovations stick in U.S. government? Because I mean, U.S. government's like kind of renowned for being a huge bureaucratic beast. So have you seen any innovations stick?
Yeah, actually, we have a good example within USAID that I would highlight. It's called the Global Development Alliance, and you know why this is a good example is because if you are familiar with that, we say GDA for short. You might be thinking, "What? That's so commonplace. How is that an innovation?" And that itself is a hallmark of an innovation. When it becomes commonplace, it was an innovation, and then becomes kind of the norm. So these GDAs were started roughly, I think, 2001. And the whole idea behind them, Global Development Alliance, is basically a fancy name for partnership with the private sector. And essentially, it involves three parties, and it's all kind of encapsulated through a memorandum of understanding. And so the first party is USAID, the funder, giving out a grant in this case. The second party is that grantee, the recipient of the grant. And then the third is that private sector entity that comes in and says, "You know what, I'll match the amount of the grant either in kind or with our own funding." And so that's the responsibility of the grantee to bring that private sector partner in, and we call that leverage. And so those three parties, so, for example, if it's $1 million grant, then the private sector entity provides also $1 million or $1 million in kind. And so it's a $2 million activity in this example, and all three parties are working at it together. So that's something where you're saying, wait, so yeah, that sounds pretty straightforward. Why is that an innovation? Well, guess what? It was, to your point, just using our existing grant regulations, and there was nothing new that was added. There were no new authorities that were needed. It was almost like a creative restructuring, if you will, or creative kind of re-envisioning of what we could already do within our existing regulations.
And
Let me
who?
just.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in there because Jonathan's already beginning to talk about solutions, I think. So I think it's possibly a good moment to sum up, if I can, a couple of the problems that you were just mentioning. So you talked principally about the silos, about the number of rules that there are and people don't know the rules, and risk aversion as well as three problems. But it also struck me that all three, there's kind of good reason for why they are there. Aneta, you mentioned silos are what help to replicate a process at scale. The rules and regulations are about accountability. Maybe the risk aversion is linked to that as well. This is public money. There needs to be assurances in place that it's going to be spent properly and responsibly. So although they're the problems, they aren't going to be going away, right? So it strikes me that there's a good reason for them to be there. They aren't going to be going away. And so then what, right? And this is what Jonathan was just bringing up there. You're going to be having to work. You're going to have to work within these rules.
I have one more, if I can, just off of
Please,
the GDA
yeah,
example, because I think this is actually on day-to-day, this is actually proven to be one of the most important challenges. You're working in a single organization. You think you speak the same language, and you don't. You simply don't. Like, what I say as a risk specialist, or what I say as an auditor, or what I say as a finance specialist or a lawyer totally doesn't translate. Literally, the wording doesn't make any sense to anybody in the programmatic teams at all. And I have to literally search for, and it's like speaking a different language. You literally have to have the ability to speak different language, which means that if you're a senior person and you come in and you say, machine, build me a blah, 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 right? What that would require is that machine to be like, okay, the blah, blah, blah means translate that into each of my silos, which means people would need to be capable of taking that new idea and translating it into what they think it means in their own technical language, in their own set of rules and regulations. And that alone is difficult, right? That alone is difficult. So what you need, and I think what we're going to get to here, you need a master mechanic. You need somebody who has enough of an understanding across the silos of all the different rules and regulations where everyone can stay safe, stay within their driving lanes and not violate, law basically and policy, and yet be capable of bringing together a different approach. And I think that's what we're suggesting, that there is a ability to do that, but you actually, in order to tap into a master mechanic kind of mentality and skill set, you need somebody, you need professionals who understand the machine from the inside very well. And they don't just understand one silo. They understand all the silos, and in many ways they understand the potential of the silos, not what they do now, but what they could do given their own regulations. And that's also, our core theme.
As you're saying too, Aneta, not only should they understand all the silos, they should know how to translate. So being an internal translator of external concepts. And so an example would be when impact bonds came out, first were SIBs, social impact bonds in the UK, and then we made the jump over to development impact bonds. You know what the problem though has been? These aren't actually bonds in the financial terminology. These are merely funding structures. And then on top of that, if you layer on the word financing, people in government bureaucracy start thinking authorities questions. Understandably, they're saying, wait, we don't have the authority to do quote unquote financing, meaning equity or debt or perhaps loan guarantees. That's a separate kind of thing, maybe funding more generally. So to the point, sometimes you're talking past each other, even though you want to achieve the same goals. And for these impact bonds, whether they're SIBs or DIBs, guess how we've participated, or guess how USAID has participated in the past, by giving a grant as part of a larger impact bond structure. So again, no new authorities, no new regulations, but understanding that and translating it. The last thing I would highlight on the problems, and then we can get into some solutions here, but is think about as well the challenge when we talk about culturally, why are bureaucracies so kind of risk averse? Well, when you're dealing with public funding, especially, there's a higher level of scrutiny, understandably, or even if you're a foundation or a philanthropic organization, you have donors you have to account for. So I think that also adds to kind of that culture of risk aversion that we're dealing with here in terms of the overall challenges. Aneta, let me ask you a question though. You were saying that in the past, just quickly, the rules though, the complex web of rules, and there's so many rules and regulations for whatever bureaucracy we're talking about. But on the flip side, there's a reason for that too, right? I mean, there's a reason why a lot of these rules are in place. Can you just speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, as the rules controller here. Look, I mean, so the first point, and I think we mentioned this earlier, is the fact that when you're dealing with public funding, the first and foremost obligation of any institution is to demonstrate that funding hasn't been abused, and the term we use is called safeguarding. And a lot of the rules and regulations actually come from this, what we call a fiduciary obligation to the public. You'll see that very heavily in risk statements that organizations, public funding agencies or departments issue. They'll often issue a what we call risk appetite statement, which says, we have a high risk tolerance for programmatic innovation, meaning we want to encourage innovation you know, to achieve sort of our objectives, but we have a zero tolerance, literally, appetite for any sort of non-compliance, fiduciary non-compliance. And you hear that a lot, actually, in everywhere. That's one piece here, and I think what that basically tells the silos, when you translate that down into silos, what that means is some parts of the silo are encouraged to innovate, right? The programmatic ones, the technical ones, but the silos whose job it is to control for fiduciary compliance, like procurement, like finance, like legal, right? Let's take 3. Those guys, what they hear coming out of that is that they are supposed to say no to anything that seems slightly risky. And in many ways, you know, that should work, except that sometimes we need to be able to, well, let's just put it this way. We in my experience, the nature of the risk switches when you try something new, and it requires a more nuanced analysis of trade-offs to really enable the machine to work together. And I think this is why we get a lot of these, I want to innovate and I'm telling you no. It does come from the top, but then it also comes from this idea that we're not quite used to managing new risks that present in new ways with an innovation. And I do think this is, again, why I keep saying, like, one needs to have a master mechanic who doesn't leave the control functions to themselves to run in isolation. It's somebody who can bring it all together and understands, you know, everything from the policy and how risk management happens. I've been doing risk management for a long time, and then understands how to execute that risk management in a responsible way through all the different silos.
Yeah, no, that's a key point, because also the challenge, if you don't understand your own bureaucracy and you don't take the time to really appreciate the rules and regulations and just want to be the ideas person, the challenge with that is you're going to also run into problems within those silos when you get some inevitable pushback, and you don't even know what questions then to ask to say, exactly. Well, what do you mean by, you know, whatever, when you say no? Is it a hard no? Why? What's the rule, the specific rule that says no? Or is this a personal preference because you just feel uncomfortable? So
without offending the person.
Without offending, obviously, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the backstops, the silos have their roles, and the people doing them know their stuff, which makes them good. But to your point, to our point, you need that master mechanic, as you're saying, who sees the bigger picture and is able to dive in to some extent with each silo.
So one term we've been using for this master mechanic is risk to innovation thinkers. People whose job it actually is, or who they understand the job of basically managing risk, which is bringing down the fiduciary risks in particular. But, you know, there is a whole cohort of people. There could be finance people, they can be lawyers. I think Jonathan and I are both lawyers, so we're going to just openly, we have a bias towards lawyers, I think, on this call.
I was going to, I think, I don't know if this is where you were going, but the question I was going to ask is, so it's who is to play this role, the master mechanic role, the person who has their head across the silos, knows the language, can be the translator of terminology. So is it you two? Should someone else in the organization, do they come to their compliance team? Do they think, well, I should take it upon myself to be the master mechanic, to continue with that metaphor?
Jonathan.
Yeah, it sounds counterintuitive to people listening to this, saying, wait, you lawyers are the ones who get in the way often. No, I mean, I do think, you know, yes is the general answer. However, it's not necessarily anybody coming from a compliance background. And I think this is, you know, when we talk about, okay, so how do we have some concrete ideas to make this stick? You know, one is, on that point, I would say, go and first start with the risk people, you know, the different teams, whether that's compliance, certainly legal, perhaps others, and start with them, and then say, okay, of you all though, who are the innovators here? who has a perspective not just of saying no, but actually using risk as a means for innovating, because that's what's really powerful. Because then when you're trying something new, if you can show, in particular to outside groups, saying, we have actually identified the risk better than anybody else, and then we've also come up with ways to try to mitigate that risk while pushing forward this bigger idea. We're not just saying, no, 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 missing the forest for the trees. We're actually saying we're going to not only try to promote this great idea, but we're also going to try to get ahead as best we can of that risk. So start with the very people who are these gatekeepers of your reputation, and then of that group, find the innovators.
And you could do that in lots of ways. I mean, in most cases, you'll find that those people are innovating anyway in their little teams, and people know who they are. Like people will be like, oh, that person's really pragmatic. You can really do some great stuff with them. And it just comes out in the wash. But if you're not doing that, then you've got these ideas of hackathons we've had sort of organized. If leadership wanted to pull out those people to help them then basically facilitate the standardization of their practices within their silos. That's what we're trying to sort of articulate. You can identify those people who are within those silos, who are kind of have tendencies to innovate. They can be in each of those compliance functions, right? And if they actually are identified and then sort of pulled out to be like even a task force that helps kind of glue the stuff together and start creating consistency and process, and basically training by doing their colleagues, right? Look, there's this set of regulations that we already have in place, like Jonathan, your idea of these grants that have been used for SIBs and DIBs, right? It's the regulations are already in place. So all you really are trying to do is you're trying to find sort of peer teachers who are helping the others pick up a new skill set to start being able to process this stuff on a consistent basis. That's one idea, right? Another idea I've actually had is I've actually intentionally moved people around silos. So I've taken finance officials and put them in programmatic functions for loans, development assignments, and vice versa. You know, you can take programmatic people who are innovative and you put them in the procurement team or the legal team or for a period of time, because when you put a different hat on, you start to understand, first of all, you learn the language. Secondly, you start to understand their limitations, right? You're forced to think through their lens, and then it's the combination of this. You can actually build a workforce that has a much less siloed way of thinking in silos by leveraging sort of the development assignment horizontal path.
Yeah, that's really important, because I was gonna ask too, just generally. So, what if you're not in one of these positions already, or you're not in a leadership role to be able to place people? What if you're starting from the bottom of a bureaucracy? You know, what should you maybe do to position yourself to be more effective, especially if you are one of these innovative kind of thinkers? And Aneta, that's why I think your point about thinking horizontally makes so much sense, as opposed to a lot of times we're just thinking, oh, vertically, how do I rise up the chain? The challenge with that traditionally has been, you might be really good in your particular backstop, you rise up through an organization, but then you don't actually have as much visibility into the different other silos as we've been talking about. And so I think from a practical perspective, if you're starting out at kind of a junior level, the most junior level of bureaucracy, find those ways to plug in horizontally, even if someone's not intentionally placing you in those other silos or helping you do those internal secondments.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think if you're aiming for a true leader of a bureaucracy, you know, in our ideal world, would really understand how the whole machine works, would themselves be the master mechanics, right? Who can really help move all the pieces around together. So if you're sort of in Oxford, you know, trying to make a career in public sector and thinking about how am I going to get myself in 20 years into an executive, you know, senior role, it really, and I think this is where I think Mara, the head of GoLab, has said, if it's sexy, if it sounds sexy, it's probably too innovative and it's not going to work. You've got to figure out the boring parts of how to operationalize something. It needs to become boring, right? Which means you have to understand the rules. You have to understand the procurement rules. You have to understand the financial consequences. You have to understand all these kind of boring pieces to really execute your great grand ideas.
That's important too, with the whole external internal balance, and saying, I think on sticking on the so-called boring piece, it's speaking the language of bureaucracy of your colleagues internally. That's what we really mean by take a great flashy idea from the outside and make it boring. That's how to actually operationalize it. But then be able to speak outside externally and saying, but here's what we're really trying to achieve. Here's how it fits in with the broader kind of agenda, and not bore people with bureaucratic jargon. I think being that kind of translator, both internally and externally, is really key. That's a skill to be developed.
But I will make one more plug for lawyers, and I think this is just from my experience, because I think, Jonathan, you work in an organization where the regulations are really handed to you by, federal government. So I work in an organization where we make our rules because we're international. And there will be situations where your laws and your regulations don't let you do what you want to do. And guess what? Lawyers are there to change the rules. We write the rules. So there is also a path, and I think it's worth highlighting, that if there is a need for something and the rule book isn't set up for that thing, you can actually, don't give up. That's my point. Don't just say, oh, the rules aren't there, therefore I can't do innovation for this. That's not true. What you do need to do, though, is you need to set yourself up to explain why the rule needs to be changed, how it needs to be changed, and how, therefore, all these consequential regulations and processes and across all the silos would then need to be adjusted for those new rules. And that's what I've been doing internally. I've done some innovations, worked across silos, right? Brought different innovators together, realized we've got 80% of the rules, 20% are missing. And as a lawyer, I'm now able to go back and say, here's how we need to change the rules. And we're doing that.
So the rules can be changed as well occasionally. Even the lawyers will admit to that. I think this is great. Some of these how points that you've been making about how the route towards some of these solutions might actually look, and I think particularly the fact that it's things that people can take the initiative on themselves. So maybe there's not a formal program of secondments within the organization, but Aneta, you said that entry level, bottom of the hierarchy staff member can still do the work of thinking horizontally, can still learn the rules. It's been repeated throughout this course, this emphasis on knowing what the rules are, because that's where the power then to be able to use them productively towards innovation comes from that basis of knowledge. We're about at time there anyway, so we can wrap up, but I wonder if I can just give you a chance to maybe give your final distillation of the key message about innovation, about compliance as the position from which to innovate. Why don't I start with you, Jonathan?
Sure. Yeah, I would say just again, use the kind of guardians of risk, if you will, as your first stop of potential sources of innovation. Because again, it's not just about big ideas; it's about making big ideas stick within bureaucracies, and that requires a solid understanding of the rules and regulations. And I think that being able to translate concepts and ideas from the outside to how to operationalize that inside is key. So being that internal translator of external ideas, that's a skill that's worth developing.
And I have a message, I think, just to complement this, because, just to add a little angle, I have a message for the leadership in these organizations. I think leadership, very correctly, first of all, is just trying to stay afloat, trying to get the next, a budgetary allocation, is often afraid to take risks, and innovation basically could sound like risk to a leader in an agency, because if you just do business as usual, no one can blame you for that. But if you try to do something, stick your neck out, try to do something new, now you've got a potential risk that you can be called out for. So what I wanted just to signal to the leadership is use your lawyers. basically you have a lot of people in the organization who can actually provide you with a much broader solution space in the existing regulatory framework than you think you have. And leverage your regulatory structures and your processes as they are to their fullest extent, because no one can blame you for staying in the regulatory system that you already have. So that is your first, and you may actually find that that's enough to get the ball rolling.
And Aneta, let me just say, people might be listening and saying, yeah, but I've tried using my lawyers and that person just told me no. So maybe
go find a different lawyer.
Yeah, use the right lawyers. And that's the other thing is, if you find an Aneta in your organization, for example,
Or
have
Jonathan.
that kind of lawyer talk to the other lawyers within your organization. That's the key. Don't just say, oh, well, that one lawyer I had a bad experience with. It's really, again, someone who knows the rules and regulations really well and therefore knows how to use that to promote innovation. That's the
and
key.
speaks credibly with their peers. Yeah, I agree.
That's perfect. Thanks so much to you both for taking the time to record that, to get your thoughts down there for our audience. I'll just say anyone who's watching or listening who's interested in the work of the Go Lab, particularly in the Fellows of Practice program, you can find more on our website. Just search for the Government Outcomes Lab. There's profiles of Aneta and Jonathan there under the Fellows of Practice page as well, so you can find out more about them. And I think that's about it. So we can wrap it up there, can we? Thanks so much, both, and see you again
Harry.
soon.
All right.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks. Take care.
Have a great rest of the day, everybody.